how does God view all this confusion? I'm sure it grieves his heart, but what does the Bible say he feels about this?
Well, it's not that he is taken by surprise, because really God has given us also epistles that speak to us in a special way in those last days in which we are living right now. And so we find, for example, in the second epistle to Timothy, we find there that there is some guidance towards that time. So God speaks in the first epistle to Timothy through Paul of the house of God, and that's what we know, right? The house of God being composed only by living stones, while what we're speaking before, that people get baptized with just in the waters of baptism and then profess that they are Christians, but they are not really. It's like adding now dead stones to the building, right? There's no dead stone in Scripture really, but that's how we could put it, right? Mm-hmm. So we have the living stones. We have an addition now, pretty big actually today in Christendom, of many professors that just say that they are Christians and are not. And so you have a house that is now called the Great House. So in the first epistle to Timothy, it's the house of God, composed only by true believers. In the second epistle to Timothy, you have the Great House. Maybe we just turn to that passage and go through it a little bit, because that's really the answer to how God looks at it, mm-hmm. and what the solution is actually, even for those who would like to be faithful in these times in which we are living.
So as we're turning to it, are you by implication saying that the great house is really not so great? Is it a bad thing, or is it?
Yeah, it's a big house really, and in American it sounds like great, but it's really rather not so great actually. Mm-hmm. I know that some have put it in a positive way, but we can look through the passage now and really try to understand what it says there.
Okay.
So that is what we find in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And we find it, we could read maybe from verse 19. But God's firm foundation stands, bearing this seal. And now we have like a coin with two sides. One side is the Lord knows those who are His. And that is a blessed thing, that God really knows who are His children, who are really true. In this time of confusion, He knows that. But then the other side of the coin is, let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. So, realizing that there has been iniquity introduced into the church, God is now telling us, listen, you are all responsible. Every one of us is responsible to do what is right before Him and to depart from iniquity, to stay away from it. Right? In terms of what we had with the Jerusalem, it's really to stay there where it's holy and to keep the iniquity outside. Mm-hmm. But there is a little difference here, and we will come to that, with regard to what was in the beginning of the church. In the beginning of the church, the iniquity, or that which was wrong, had to be put out through church discipline. That's still true today in principle. But you could be in a surrounding, you could be in a church today, where there's so much confusion and so much evil that is being allowed, that now you have to actually depart from that iniquity. And that's the focus we have here. And that's why it is introduced in these words, where it says, let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. It's now the individual that has himself to depart from iniquity. And that's what we find in the next verses here. Then it says, now in the great house. So the great house is a picture. And there are not only vessels of gold and silver. What are vessels in Scripture? Right? Vessels in Scripture. This one is an elect vessel to me. So it's people.
Yeah.
Right? The Apostle Paul is speaking here about people. Gold and silver. When we think of gold and silver, we think of the gold, the justice of God, the righteousness of God, the glory of God. when we think of silver, we think of the redemption money that we find in Exodus chapter 30, for example. And so we have been redeemed, right, with the precious blood of Christ. So in those vessels of gold and silver, we would see believers, right? When you take fire and you bring that fire to the gold and silver, what happens? Melts, right? And so when it melts, what comes out is the impurities. Right. So the silver and the gold gets more refined and more pure and even better before God, right? But there are not only those believers of gold and silver, but also those of wood and clay. Now, take that same fire, the searching fire of God, and you have the wood and clay. What happens? It burns up. Cannot withstand that check, right?
So those two things are in the house, the great house.
In this great house, there's vessels that are of gold and silver, believers, and wood and clay, which is unbelievers. You see the mixture here in the great house. That's how it is composed.
Okay.
Then comes the second characteristic. Some, it says here, for honorable use, and some for dishonorable. So a vessel could be used for honorable use or for dishonorable use. Which ones are used for dishonorable use? And which ones for honorable use? Well, let's start with the unbelievers. Can they ever please God? There's a verse, right, that says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Mm-hmm. So the unbelievers, those vessels of wood and clay, as we have it here, they can never be to the honor of the master's house, right? Mm. The master of the house. But then there is the others, the believers, they can be to the honor of the house master, right? But even believers, as we saw in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, could be to the dishonor of the Lord. If they live in a sinful way, right? Hmm. So what happens now? We have to see that the believers can be to the honor of God, but unfortunately also to the dishonor. So that is how far we get. Now comes the condition. Therefore, if anyone cleanse himself from what is dishonorable, or the vessel to dishonor, as some put it, if he does that, what happens then? He will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. And that's what we want, right? That's what I want. I would love to be found as one that is useful to the master, that can be used for every good work, that is set apart for him, holy. That is what we want. And the question is now, do I fulfill this condition? So the condition that we have is what? If anyone cleanse himself from these, or what is dishonorable. The King James says it, if anyone purge himself from these. Now when you go into that word, purge himself, you will find the same word also in 1 Corinthians 5. And that's what I was alluding to just a while ago. The man there that was living in sin, he had to be put out through church discipline. And so the assembly could be, or the church there could be back into purity, into fellowship. They could remain in fellowship with the Lord. Right? They were dealing with the matter. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Leaven speaks of sin. And so they were keeping the assembly pure by this church discipline. But here in 2 Timothy, we have reached now a point where the church is in a state where everything is chaotic. You are in an environment where you would love to do this correction, but you can't. You can start doing that. I mean, try to go to, if you are in that environment, and try to put things right. You will see that you will be the one that has to go finally. Yeah. And that's the only way. Purge himself from these. So purge out the old leaven in 1 Corinthians 5 is put out the man. Yeah. Purge yourself now from these in 2 Timothy means you have to go out now in order to stay apart from the iniquity.
I have a question there then, because it's kind of triggering some things in my mind from earlier on in the conversation.
Yeah.
Does this not add further to the divisions if I purge myself and separate myself? What am I separating myself from, to call it a group, to something else?
Well, that is exactly how the apostle continues here. He says in verse 22, so flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness.
1 Timothy 2.
2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22.
Okay.
Yeah. It says, as we continue in the text here, so flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness. Righteousness, it says. Faith, love. And then it says, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from or out of a pure heart.
Mm.
So what happens is he's instructing Timothy to separate himself from that iniquity. And he's telling him, listen, you might think if you go out that you create a new separation, you will be finding yourself alone outside there. But it's not so. It is, you will find others who actually see the same thing. And they will also come out. And you will be able to pursue now righteousness with those who call upon the name of the Lord out of pure heart.
Thanks for watching the Church Call. If you enjoyed the clip and want to watch the full discussion, check out the lower right video. We upload new content Thursdays and occasionally Tuesdays, so subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay tuned. To learn more about today's video or to ask a question, please leave a comment below. We do want this to be a God-honoring environment, so we ask for comments to be made in grace and truth to one another. God bless, and remember to rethink church biblically.